Okay, can somebody please read what's on the screen?
Shifting to a formal style.
Okay, so we're going to discuss now shifting to a formal style. Okay, when we write for the academe, we need to follow a formal style. Okay, in the same way that we do not go to school wearing beach attire, okay, we try to be more formal in our writing because it's academic writing. Okay, so when you use formal style, you tell the reader to take you seriously. Formal style tells the reader to take the writer seriously. Formal style also helps remove ambiguity. Okay? But formal style requires changes in word use and grammatical structures. Okay, so here today we will be discussing shifting to a formal style. Okay, so into a formal style involves changes in word use. And in doing so, we need to avoid informal words. We try to avoid phrasal verbs. We use the formal negative. We remove contractions. We avoid the use of second person. And we use the first person only to show that you are personally making an assertion. And we use appropriate punctuation like semicolons and commas. Okay, so you need to avoid informal words. A lot of is an example of informal words. Cultural museum has a lot of artifacts. That's informal. So you can change that to the cultural museum has many artifacts. Another one is likes. The isolated people group likes to use rafts instead of boats. You say, instead of using like, you say, you use prefer. The isolated people group prefer to use rafts instead of boats. Instead of like, to use prefer. And instead of maybe adding more details could strengthen the claim. You replace the word maybe with perhaps. Perhaps adding more details could strengthen the claim. So it's a lot formal to sound. You're not being informal. Okay? The area of the plastic island is getting bigger. You say the area of the plastic island is increasing. Okay? You avoid informal words, you replace them with more formal words. So you sound more formal, you sound more serious. Okay, here are other informal words. Say no. So you reject. You use reject instead of say no. Instead of saying right, you say correct, proper, or appropriate. Instead of saying throw away, you use the word discard. Instead of using bad, you use the word negative. Instead of using the word think about, you use the word consider or ponder. Instead of using come back, use the word return. Or go, instead of using go away, you use leave. Or even better, you can use the word depart. Okay? Instead of saying speak to, use the word address. And you don't use the word got, it's very informal. Use the word obtained instead. As I said, you can email me if you want a copy of this presentation. You can email me at andyacademic@gmail.com. Now, and so forth and etc. are actually considered informal. Okay, so you don't use and so forth or etc. Instead, okay, use something else. These semiconductors can be used in robots, USB drives, etc. Instead of etc., you can replace that with these semiconductors can be used in robots, USB drives, and other electronic devices. So it's a lot more formal. Okay. Pesticides, fertilizers, and so forth are banned. That's informal. You can replace that with Pesticides, fertilizers, and other farm chemicals are banned. Okay, so remember, and so forth, and etc. are considered informal. You can replace that with something that's related to your list. Okay, you also need to avoid phrasal verbs. The mandala looks like a circle. The mandala, by the way, is a Hindu symbol. It's a Hindu symbol. The mandala looks like a circle, but instead of using looks like, you say the mandala resembles a circle because you're avoiding phrasal verbs. Phrasal verbs tend to be informal. Changing the code could get rid of the problem. Get rid of is a very informal phrasal verb. You replace it by saying changing the code could remove the problem. A country has lots of underutilized graduates. Lots of is also a phrasal verb that's and phrasal verbs are informal. Okay, so you say a country has many underutilized graduates. Okay, now in shifting to a formal style, you also use the formal negative. Instead of saying not any, you have to use no. So for example, the analysis did not yield any new results. You replace that with the analysis yielded no new results. You see the word did not is quite informal. Okay, so instead of saying the analysis did not yield any new results, you say the analysis yielded no new results. Not much is replaced by little. Okay? The government did not allocate much funding. You simply say the government allocated little funding. That's the formal negative. Okay? Not many can be replaced by few. This problem does not have many viable solutions. Simply say, you replace it by saying, this problem has few viable solutions. As I told you, did not and does not tend to be informal. So you need to replace does not and did not with something more formal. In this case, instead of saying this problem does not have many viable solutions, you say this problem has few viable solutions. Okay? So you can also change the negative to something affirmative, something that sounds affirmative. Instead of saying not careful, you say careless. Instead of saying not the same, you say different. Instead of saying not allow, you use prevent. So you try to avoid the construction not blank, not blank. Okay? Not notice could be replaced by overlook. Not many can be replaced by few. Not often can be replaced by rarely. Not stop can be continued by continue. And not include could be replaced by omit. Okay, so you change from negative to affirmative. You also, of course, many of you know this already. You need to remove contractions. The school can't afford to purchase an electron microscope. You say the school cannot afford to purchase an electron microscope. Removing scaffolds won't solve the problem. Instead, you say removing scaffolds will not solve the problem. By the way, won't can be used in editorial. If you are into journalism, editorials allow contractions like won't. Okay, but in academic writing, you have to replace that with will not. Okay. Then you also avoid using second person because when you use second person, when you use the word you or your, it sounds authoritative. It's like you're ordering somebody to do something. Okay, so you try to avoid using second persons. You say, for example, we warn you that this document may contain explicit and sensitive content. Instead, you say, readers are warned that this document may contain explicit and sensitive content. You're not being direct. Okay? you're using third person. I think as Filipinos, we understand the importance of avoiding the second person by being indirect. Okay? The first person is used only for making general assertions as the author. Okay? When you are making assertions, when you are making arguments, that's the time that you use the first, only the first person. For example, in this paper, I assert that using the mother tongue for basic education yields better results. I will provide arguments supporting the value of multilingual education. So you can use and you should use the first person for making general assertions as author. In the past, noong unang panahon, instead of using I, people would say the writer. So in this paper, the writer asserts that using the mother tongue for basic education yields better results. In the past, that was the norm, but nowadays that has changed. Okay, instead of saying this writer or the writer, you use I already when you are the one making the general assertion. Okay, so that has changed from what our parents were using into what we are using now. Okay, let's talk a little bit about grammatical constructions in producing a formal style. Okay, grammatical constructions also play a part in producing a formal tone. Okay, one way is to place adverbs before verbs. It produces a more formal tone. Okay, for example, actually, very little is known about the general nature and prevalence of scientific dishonesty. You put actually before the word known. That is more formal. Very little is actually known about the general nature and prevalence of scientific dishonesty. So instead of actually very little is known, you say very little is actually known. So you sound more formal when you write that. The model was developed by Krashen originally. Okay, that sounds a little bit informal. You can make it more formal sounding by putting the adverb before the verb. The model was originally developed by Krashen. Okay, so that sounds a little more formal. Okay? And yet, placing adverbs before verbs may require you to split infinitives. The school needs to adequately meet the needs of those enrolled in the program. Okay, now there are some grammar books that forbid students or writers from splitting infinitives. Dapat daw the to and the meet should not be separated. The to and classify should not be separated according to those grammar books. But those actually have no basis for saying so. It's actually more appropriate if we split infinitives so that we could put the adverb before the verb. So it's more formal to say the school needs to adequately meet the needs of those enrolled in the program. Neural networks have the ability to correctly classify new patterns. So it's a lot more, it's more formal. It's okay to split infinitives so that you can place adverbs before verbs. Okay? Now, in many cases, using direct questions may be informal. Okay? What can be done to lower costs? You replace that with with a declarative. Considering how costs may be lowered is necessary. Or you can say the institution now needs to consider how costs can be lowered. Okay, so using direct questions can be informal. It's like you're talking. Okay, when you write, you should sound more formal. So you replace direct questions with declaratives. Okay, we now go to the final part of writing a formal, shifting to a formal style. We need to use formal punctuation. Okay, A semicolon, the dot on top, and the comma below has many important uses in formal writing. Okay? Semicolons are like full stops. They're like periods that join two closely connected complete sentences. When those sentences are closely connected, it would be more formal to use semicolons. It also signals to your reader that those two sentences are closely related. For example, delays in production lowered productivity, semicolon. This decrease in productivity affected profits. Okay? So the semicolon shows us that those two sentences are closely related and you have produced something more formal. Semicolons can be used with sentence connectors. Okay? Note the comma after the connector in the following. Okay? Raw materials became more expensive, semicolon. However, comma, this was compensated for by cheaper production processes. So when you use the semicolon and the comma, it's as if it's one it's one whole idea. Although it's composed of two complete sentences that are supposed to produce two complete ideas, because you use a semicolon, it makes it sound like it's just one idea. Okay, so it's more formal. Now here's another use of semicolons. Semicolons can be used to separate long pieces of text. Okay, if it's long, instead of using comma a comma, you can use a semicolon. For example, some of the solutions to the air traffic delay problem include increasing the size of airports that routinely experience flight delays, semicolon, overhauling the traffic control system so that more flights can be safely handled, semicolon, and increasing landing fees, which are currently based on the weight of the aircraft during peak periods. So because it's longer, the the piece of text is longer, it's more appropriate to use semicolons instead of commas. Okay? So also a comma helps readers identify breaks in sentences. Okay? A comma must be present when a sentence starts with a dependent clause. When we say dependent clause, it means a clause that does not contain a complete thought. For example, okay, you need to use a comma in this sentence. Because governments believe that all lands belong to the state, comma, indigenous people's rights are endangered. Now you need to put a comma after the dependent clause that starts with the word because. But if you start your sentence with an independent clause, you should not put a comma. Here's the example. Indigenous people's rights are endangered because governments believe that all lands belong to the state. Okay, in the first example, because you started with the word because, you need to put a comma. But in the second example, because you started with a complete sentence, you should not, with a complete clause or independent clause, you should not put a comma. Okay, so that's the difference in terms of using a comma. Okay, commas help readers see a complete thought when two sentences are combined using coordinate conjunctions. For example, pesticides pose a threat to health. That's one complete thought. Fertilizers pose a threat to soil chemistry. That's another complete thought. Now, if you combine them with the word and, when you put a comma before the word and, it helps signal to the reader that you are combining two complete thoughts. Okay, so you say pesticides pose a threat to health, comma, and fertilizers pose a threat to soil chemistry. So that the comma there, the small comma, helps the reader realize that you are combining two complete thoughts. Okay, so that's for the use of punctuation for producing a formal style. We use a semicolon and we can use a comma to produce more formal style. In conclusion, formal writing is another style of writing that requires the writer to use different structures, words, and approaches. Thank you very much.